Welcome to Des Talks, a new podcast from Design Exhibition Scotland. I'm Susanna Beaumont, and I look forward to sharing with you over the coming months a series of insightful and rich conversations with some of our most brilliant, adventurous makers, designers, artists, craftspeople and curators. So welcome. I'm delighted today to be joined by Chris Dobson, architect and designer, and Guy Philips, CEO and co-founder of Highland Heritage Woodworks that's based up in Aberdeenshire. We're going to be chatting today about the making of Monolith, a beauteous monolithic bench that we recently installed on the island of Bute in the grounds of Mount Stuart. This came about through a Design Exhibition Scotland open call back in 2022, where we invited proposals from across Scotland from designers, makers, craftspeople to design a public bench. And Chris was one of 4 designs that we accepted. And through the course of months and years, we have worked together with Chris. And a couple of weeks ago, we were all at Mount Stuart in rain and snow and a little bit of hail, installing Monolith. So Chris, firstly, can I just ask you about how Monolith came about as a design, and how did you what kind of, I suppose, firstly caught your eye about the open call, and why did you want to design a bench?
Yeah, sure. How did it come about? Well, I suppose the one thing, the downside of being an architect is that everything takes an inordinately long amount of time in terms of the conception to completion, and quite often competitions. There's quite a high degree of gatekeeping around them as well, and they often preclude sort of individuals or small teams who don't have the backing of a big business to go for them. So whilst I do architectural competitions through practice, it was nice for one to pop up that was kind of fairly accessible. The entry requirements were pretty kind of small, not in a negative way, but just in an accessible way. And the timing of it was actually really perfect, because I think it sat over the course of a Christmas break, if I remember.
Yes.
So, it just arrived at a moment in the kind of typical calendar year when work is shut down, that kind of post-Christmas sort of lull, and the sort of slight drift into boredom. And I kind of picked it up and was really keen to try and pull something together that I thought might be a positive entry. And I think that the kind of thing which really drew me to it was that, I suppose in lots of ways, a bench is just a small piece of architecture, and this was one of the great things about things like benches and similar street furniture is it's a real kind of tangible point of interaction between people and objects. It has to draw them in, and it has to be a point of comfort that makes them feel like they can dwell there for a while, and whether that's just sitting and taking in their surroundings or engaging in activity. And so there's a huge amount of richness, I think, in what is a relatively simple object and proposition. And I suppose the second part of it, which was of real interest, was where it was proposed to be situated. And obviously, as you said, Susanna, that was at the Mount Stuart estate. And it really opened up a kind of train of thought in my mind about the lineage of benches and shelters in the context of the islands of Scotland, and 2 in particular that I've always loved for different reasons, but are the bush shelters of Lewis and the Orkney chair. And I mean, the bush shelters of Lewis are just these kind of
maybe to explain. I mean, we're firstly talking about the Isle of Lewis. So again, I mean, the meeting of all the islands. So when did you first go to Lewis, and when did those bus shelters first catch your eye?
Yeah, so I first ended up on the Western Isles through work, actually. So we were doing a series of school projects over there. And one of the real eye-opening things around that, and this was me coming at it at the time from a complete point of ignorance, really, about the nature of those islands, was just the kind of exposure and the weather and the conditions up there. And it was really a kind of proper lesson in learning how to design something that provided shelter and responded to the harshness of the environment. So, you're the kind of weather fronts and storms that sweep in sort of unimpeded across the Atlantic. Incredible and amazing spaces for anyone who's been there. Like there's I think a beauty in their bleakness and just being able to see that weather roll in from kind of hundreds of miles away. And I think set within that, I obviously became aware of the bus shelters, which are these kind of incredible structures that are a direct response to that, which is how do you make waiting for the bus in these sort of windswept landscapes in any way comfortable, whilst allowing the person who's waiting for the bus to make sure that, they can see it approaching and it is aware of them. So that these, at their heart, incredibly simple, but also have a real elegance in that, I think, and a real thoughtfulness in terms of their implementation, and that they just absolutely respond to that kind of simple need. So these kind of big mass concrete brutalist structures. So they've always been quite close to my heart. Yeah.
And they date from the 70s. Is that right?
Yeah. So I don't know what they did before then. Presumably got severely blown around.
Yeah, it got very wet. And
so, or maybe there were bus shelters that were less equipped to deal with the weather and accordingly swept away. But anyway, yeah, I just find them just a real brilliant solution to a given problem. And then thinking about a bench and, like I say, that point of comfort, I suppose what they aren't in a sense is comfortable. They are comforting in offering shelter, but they don't give you a sense of warmth, and I suppose that's where the Orkney chair came in with its kind of enveloping back and obviously again absolutely born from specific conditions on the islands, and how do you keep people kind of warm and sheltered from drafts within their home and capture the heat from the kind of hearth and the fire, and of course the other side of that is where do you get material from, and in the context of an island setting in which there are very few, if any, trees. And so the Orkney chairs were kind of scratch built from found driftwood and straw. And again, it's that absolute localness and that kind of inherent sustainability of just being born from found material in the landscape. And those things really chimed with me. So the more I kind of thought about it, the more it began to get a sense of the fact that they are two things that could kind of be melded and coexist. And in the context of an island setting, you could create a sheltering bench. So you have something that shields you from the extremes of the environment, but obviously, hopefully gives you somewhere that is inviting and welcoming and really,
I mean, what I think about there's a real embrace in Monolith that you're melding together, as you said, these two designs, but very much rooted both in pragmatism, the pragmatism of the high back Orkney chair to, as you say, prevent drafts tickling at your ribs on a stormy night, and then the kind of deep kind of no fripperies of the Lewis bus shelter, and the way that you've kind of interwoven these two designs to create, as we've called it, a sheltering bench that is offering both a kind of port in a storm, but a kind of a place to sit, a place to enjoy, a place to relish, but also a place to relish materials, because Monolith is made of Douglas fir and it's using the cross-laminated timber technique, yes. CLT. So perhaps, maybe you can bring in Guy now as well to talk about, firstly, what is CLT?
Well, it stands for cross-laminated timber, which is basically an engineered wood product whereby clean sawn, dried timber, regardless of the species, is then brought together as a series of layers that are orthogonal to one another. So they alternate in 90-degree angles to create what is effectively an engineered product. And there are quite a number of reasons why you might do that. One of the key reasons is that you end up with a more engineered, stable product, if you like. If anyone who's ever bought a piece of timber and brought it from the outside into the inside of their house, they'll see how quickly it wants to deform and cup and twist and do all of those beautiful things that make organic materials the things that we cherish, but also create some of those problems. And I think, in an attempt to replicate an Isle of Lewis sort of concrete type bus shelter, which has angles and straight edges and flat surfaces, the only way to really do that is with an engineered product, but also making sure you stay very true to that material. So there's nothing in this thing other than Douglas fir and a bit of glue, which we can kind of come on to. But CLT, cross-laminated timber, and it's gaining a lot of traction in terms of its sustainability. It stores lots of carbon. It's a renewable resource because it's made out of timber.
When was it invented? Is there a particular time or place where it was invented or refined?
Chris probably knows more than that. I know plywood, which would be another sort of thing that people think about. Plywoods are specifically made up of plies, thin veneers of about 1 millimeter or so. Those have been around for a long, long time. I don't know what the start of it, but turn of the century type stuff, and of course aeroplanes being made out of it, exceptionally strong. Same concept. Thin layers of material, cross-laminated, bonded with a glue into a stable engineered product. In terms of CLT, it's been around on the continent for quite some time. In the UK, very few folk, if any, are making thin cross-laminated timbers. There are companies now, and we'll come on to talk about Best and maybe a company like Ecosystems. But
and maybe that, Chris, I mean, what drew you? Because I remember from your initial proposal, CLT was there first
was
and
mentioned.
foremost.
Yeah.
So
I think as Guy has touched upon, it was really, again, going back to those the sort of bush shelters of Lewis, but it's kind of born from that, really. How do you create a massive material, but one which is hopefully more sustainable than the kind of in situ concrete that they use there? So that, to me, was one of the starting points. And like I say, just by melding it with the sense of trying to create something with a sense of warmth, that was the other sort of critical factor. And I guess this was my sort of a bit of a leap of faith in my submission, and in terms of selecting CLT, well, not just CLT, Scottish produced CLT, on a bit of a wing and a prayer, really. So it's I always get these moments in, if you're successful in something, I don't know whether it's just me, but there's that immediate joy in the fact that, an excitement that you've been chosen to do something, and then that's immediately followed by this slightly oh shit moment in that I now have to do it. But it's I suppose it's been the thing that drives you, isn't it? It's kind of pushing yourself out of your comfort zone, and then using that as the launch pad to really dive into it and see if you can attain what you've set out to do. And I kind of had, I wasn't entirely ignorant of what was happening in Scotland. As Guy was saying, it was born a little bit out of frustration that, through work, the kind of rise of CLT within the architectural profession, people promoting it, but everyone you would speak to, or everyone who was supplying it in Scotland, it was coming from either Spain or Switzerland or elsewhere. So, Scotland is sitting on this, wealth of resource in terms of homegrown timber, but no means, a very few means to actually process it in that way. So once I got the good news, my first port of call was Peter Wilson of Timber Design Initiatives. I've known Peter for quite a few years, and he is a brilliant champion of the use of timber in Scotland, and he had come through Napier, who have been at the heart of a lot of research around that. And so Peter was really vital in the process, in being the initial sounding board, but also the point of introduction to Best. And obviously at the time it was Mark Milne at Best who we got in touch with. Again, just a sort of brilliant sort of champion of this stuff, and absolutely on board from the outset in trying to help us realize what we were aiming to do. And I guess Best, for people who don't know, was essentially used to be the Construction Innovation Centre in Scotland. That was its sort of former title. So that is essentially what they're about. It's about trying to harness new or emerging technologies and support Scottish suppliers and businesses around that to kind of promote new avenues of construction, I guess, within the context of the country. And so they had, as part of that, invested in a commercially sized CLT press. And so the kind of Mark I of Monolith, which was the kind of first outing of it in that initial sort of exhibition season, I suppose, Susanna, was made by them. And initially I'd suggested that it be made out of Scottish larch, just because I was kind of conscious of that being an appropriate wood to put to that use. But as you know, it had to be more flexible and adaptable. And that was really enlightening in itself in terms of realizing that the challenges in the supply chain, you can't just go out and at the moment and just source, or you couldn't at that point in time source larch that was dry enough to just put in the kiln, to put in the CLT press and be into manufacturer. So that took a long time the first time around in terms of finding suitable wood, which eventually ended up being Douglas fir and moving it from there. So like I say, it was really from a point of the keenness to kind of enter into this exploration of what can you do within the context of Scottish timber, like I say, at that point in time.
But Guy, I mean, this is something you're very interested in exploring and kind of bucking a change in a way that I think Scotland, UK imports more wood than any other country other than China. As Chris was just saying, we've got so much native trees that we can plant, we can grow, then we can fell, and then we can use. Can you, Guy, just outline how that's important to the way you think and work, and how that then fed into Monolith?
Yeah, I'd be delighted. I should share a tiny bit about our background as Highland Heritage Woodworks. We're based here in Aberdeenshire. It's the formation of me, Guy, and my business partner, Armands, who is a Latvian master carpenter, and we kind of came together about 5 years ago. I've already had a career as a geologist and fancy doing something different. And, we've always, since we started Heritage Woodworks, the first question I was posing is, why are we buying all of this imported timber for all of the high-end joinery products that are going through this business? And so we very quickly made a decision to actually invest in a small sawmill, and instantly on the back of that was the investment in a small timber drying kiln. It's a vacuum drying kiln, which is a different way of drying material. But, whilst Scotland does have an awful lot of material, which is great, it's how do you add value to that? And typically taking a tree and cutting it into wet boards, that's probably the lowest value outcome that timber is going to get. So the way that you increase its commercial value is to make sure that it's dry, and not particularly, it's dry at the right moisture content for the use case. Internal joinery, you need that at sort of 6 or 8%, whereas a building like Monolith that's going to sit outside and experience those dry, occasionally in Scotland, spells over the summer, and certainly soaking wet winters, it needs to be able to sort of to deal with that variation in moisture content. So it's about being really clear and focused around the moisture. But in terms of raw materials, you're absolutely right. The UK is shocking in the way that it brings in, it is about 98%. And I guess we must just send a lot of material from other countries through our ports into other products and then off again, which I think is why we end up bringing in more material than second only to China. In terms of Scotland, and of course there are plenty of other places in the UK that do grow sort of commercial timber. Scotland, as most folk will know, is predominantly planted with Sitka spruce. That is the bulk of the material that's coming out of Scotland, and that's fine. It has a use case and a purpose, and you could effectively consider that a crop. Now, there's plenty of other really cool and exciting species out there, one of which is Douglas fir, brought in just over 200 years ago. So it is an import, but it's well established here, and it grows very, very, very well. It's brought in by a Scottish botanist, David Douglas, I think. And when it came to kind of species choice, we had the opportunity to work with larch, but there's an awful lot of pressure on larch, actually, given the conflict around Russia and Ukraine, that a lot of what would have been larch brought in from Russia is clearly absolutely not acceptable in the UK. No one should be purchasing that. So there's a lot more demand now on homegrown UK larch. So we wanted to see, well, what other materials are out there. Douglas fir, fantastic material, grows big, grows strong. And the way that we're taking trees out, because ultimately you need to fell a tree, right? Let's not run away from that fact that you have to cut down a tree in order to create this stuff. But the way that we're going about it is to use something called continuous cover forestry, CCF, or the different acronyms associated with it. But that's about identifying individual specimens at their commercial in their commercial sweet spot, if you like. And when those trees are taken out, it's creating a lot more light and space on the forest floor for things like natural regeneration and the like.
And you've been working with Glen Dye estate, haven't you, in Aberdeenshire? Can you take where Douglas fir came from? Can you just kind of say a little bit more about how that came about and their approach to forestry, and that it's just up the road, so that whole thing in kind of miles, there's not many miles involved. And as you say, they fell a tree when it's time to fell it, rather than, sometimes you see whole fields or whole forests that are felled, but they just choose one tree at a time, take it down, brings in light, as you mentioned. So maybe just a little bit more on that.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been really fortunate to work with a really cool guy called Jim Riley, Dr. Jim Riley, and you should reach out to him if you haven't done so already. Fabulous resource. He runs an organization or a company called Fast Forestry, and he's really championing that continuous cover forestry and trying to get more small scale estates interested and involved in that. And what that is a much more scalpel-like attention to forestry. So it's not just plant huge swathes of a field, wait for 60 years, have the fastest growing species possible, because you then get biggest volume out. And because timber's sold by the weight, if you're a landowner who, let's be fair, is investing for something that's going to have a return in 60 years' time, that's quite a big deal. So you can understand why people want to grow quick-growing material. But in the case of Glen Dye, they've got some beautiful forestry, some really fantastic individual specimens, which, as you say, when it's commercially sensible to take that tree out, that's exactly what they're doing. And it's creating more light on the forest floor. It's allowing more native species to come in, which will include the reseeding of things like Scots pine and Doug fir and European larch and the like, rather than big commercial plantations. They also have commercial plantations, but they're actually taking that stuff out perhaps earlier than they would have done, with a view to rewilding it, with a view to reforesting it with more native species. And Glen Dye, as you say, is literally just up the road, 20 miles from us, actually.
And how does Douglas fir compare to larch for cross-laminated timber? Is Douglas fir a good candidate? It must be, because we've got a wonderful bench out of it. But how did that process? And for you, Chris, we've seen Monolith in larch and now in Douglas fir. How's your fondness and initial apprehensiveness of using CLT? You must now be one big champion of CLT and locally sourced wood.
I think the beauty of the product and something that is particularly nice in the Douglas fir is just, I think it is just a celebration of the material for what it is, and the grain, the tone and the color of it is just amazing, really. And I think that's one thing from the outset, that I was always wanting the material just to be expressed true to what it was. It's not about trying to grade it to the nth degree. It's just about accepting that the kind of beauty it is in all of the sort of variations that kind of sit within it. So that is it to me, really. And it's that kind of tactile quality of there's nothing between you and the timber. It's absolutely that. As Guy was saying, the bench is completely hewn from that single source of material, and that, I think, is where the kind of magic in its use lies from my perspective.
And perhaps we should just say a little bit about the location of Monolith at Mount Stuart. Mount Stuart is a stately historic house on the island of Bute, as we said. It has luscious grounds and stretches of acres that go down to the water. And Monolith is positioned at the end of a kind of walkway, at the kind of perimeters of, I suppose, the policies and the kind of gardens. Why did you? Because we wandered lots, didn't we?
Yeah.
Looking for a place, and then we landed there.
Yeah, I think so. In addition to my slightly kind of bold selection of Scottish grown CLT without a sense of whether I could actually do it or not, at the point at which I put pen to paper, I suppose I kind of committed another cardinal sin of architecture, which was designing something without knowing exactly where it was going to sit. But it actually came from one of the grounds team at Mount Stuart. So we had that great day on site, which was the first time I've been to Bute, let alone Mount Stuart, where we walked the site, as you were saying, with all of the other successful participants and the Mount Stuart team, and essentially tried to find a home for each of the benches, which was great. And it was one of the gardeners who had seen the submissions, and he had kind of wandering around a bit, and he just said, I think I know where it needs to go. And like you say, we went on this kind of stroll along that kind of formal axis that runs straight through the kind of center of the landscape and anchors the house to it. And yeah, it was that kind of furthest point, that termination. And as soon as we got up there, it was just perfect. So it's nothing to do with me and all to do with him, but it was definitely in need of a kind of full stop in terms of, like you say, the kind of Mount Stuart policies. And it's just a great moment where you emerge from that kind of more heavily wooded area and you hit that point of a kind of more expansive outlook. So you get the benefit of those kind of slightly rolling agricultural fields. You're looking out over the coast. And the other great thing about it is the orientation of the bench at the end of that walkway, because it really does shelter you from the prevailing winds. And so you were able to sit in it, kind of survey mainland beyond across the water and look back down the landscape towards Mount Stuart House. So, it really couldn't have been any better. But like I say, that is absolutely nothing to do with me. That is just pure happenstance. But just brilliant. And I think that was the moment that really made it. It's not just about the bench. It's just the kind of really perfect sighting of it.
But when we went, we were all three of us were there a few weeks ago installing Monolith, and we went round the house afterwards. And I think, Guy, you have been to Mount Stuart House before, but the level of craftsmanship and materials and wood, the carving is brilliant and kind of awe-inspiring. The marble, the light, the stained glass, the kind of richness of materials. So it's wonderful to kind of continue that story of materials to the kind of 21st century and to the outdoors, where that attention to detail, that care and craft. I mean, that's what I feel is very important about the whole project. Did you find that, Guy, actually walking around Mount Stuart House again and seeing the use of wood over the centuries?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, there's a couple of connections. I'm actually Welsh, so I know that the history and in fact much of the affluence that allowed a place like Mount Stuart to be built was built around South Wales coalfields, and I know that a lot of those sort of beautiful ornate friezes, hand carved in oak with dragonflies and robins and all of that sort of stuff almost comes to life in a very tangible, because they're all 3D, they kind of jump literally out of the wall. I think for me actually was the opportunity to share with my Latvian master carpentry team, look, here's some exceptional quality of work. And quite interestingly, they say, oh yeah, we can do that, which was great to know. And I guess as a business owner, allows me to have comfort and confidence that a structure like Monolith is in the very best of hands. Just to roll back a moment is around, a tree like Douglas fir. It's whilst it's a beautiful material, it does have elements to it. So most folk know about bark and sapwood, the stuff on the outside, which on a seasonal basis allows moisture to travel up and down the tree. And then you have the pink, rich heartwood in the middle, and it's the heartwood that we've actually used for this material for Monolith, because actually sapwood is no good in an outside context. So a couple of things I wanted to land was that, one, there's a real responsibility for us as and for Chris as well, as an architect, as a sawmiller, as a carpenter, is to make sure that every component of that tree has a use. And we don't just go for the sweet spot heartwood in the middle and we turn the rest into wood chip. That's a really, really bad outcome. So when we take these big oversized logs, because that's what we kind of specialize in a big, 800 or 900 mil Douglas fir, is that, yes, we know we don't want the hardwood for Monolith, but we actually get some beautiful furniture grade floorboards or some NLT is another engineered product, nail laminated timber, where the beautiful kind of cream colored sapwood flame interacts with the heartwood. So just one of it about just sort of land a point around, proper sustainability isn't just saying, hey, we build with timber, end of story. It's, hey, we build with timber, it's being replanted, it comes from continuous cover forestry, and we used absolutely every part of that was practically possible. I mean, for our own site, we used the wood bark waste as wood chips powering that helps drive that kiln. We could run it on diesel, but we don't. It's a far more expensive way to do that. So I think just that holistic approach to materials and trying to share that. Chris is, well along that journey, and I think we could do well to sort of share some of that overall responsibility around the full package of materials available in something as simple as timber.
And maybe, Guy, because I know what's key to HHW is also innovation, as you say, looking at what you do holistically, looking at how you source, looking at where the trees come from, that kind of provenance. Maybe, I know you've mentioned working on or kind of investigating and making a ply. Can you just say a little bit about that, of what you want HHW to kind of grow into?
Yeah, absolutely. As Chris mentioned, many of these engineered products, the continent's way ahead of us. And, and these engineered products exist abroad, but yes, they're made of timber, but when you start adding on carbon miles and the like, it just sort of starts to fall down a bit. And we really have to ask honest questions about that stuff. The best way of doing it is to utilize those renewable materials, but actually start manufacturing it far more locally. So yes, you're absolutely right. We've been doing, in this case, 100 millimeter or so thick CLT, 5 layers, 20 mil. We're also now on a journey of making what's called a thin CLT, which is a thin cross-laminated timber. So exactly the same structure as this, made out of 3 elements, each 6 millimeters thick. And one huge benefit of that is that in comparison to a plywood, one, it's not imported typically from somewhere like Malaysia or Brazil or China or somewhere like that. Those plywoods are coming in with 6, 7, 8, 9 layers in them. And the amount of glue that's going into that is far outweighing the carbon sequestering benefit because you're basing it on a petroleum-based glue. So what we're doing is minimizing the number of glued interfaces. And where we are right now is to use relatively standard off-the-shelf glues. But we're on a real mission working with a small company to make an entirely bio glue, not just bio-based, but an entirely bio glue. And I think if we manage to achieve that, we're on a pretty good route at the moment, we will have a really, really compelling product, which would make, I'll put Chris on the spot, make it really difficult for Chris to say, hey, let's go and get plywood from Brazil, when you can get a homegrown thin CLT made with bioglue from material within 20 or 30 miles of where it's being manufactured. That would be a great outcome. And to democratize that as well, to allow get Wales doing their own thing and Northern England doing that. That'd be a great outcome. Sorry, Susanna.
And are you getting any kind of governmental, Scottish government support? I mean, I'm just thinking, because these are such important initiatives to answer big questions about carbon and the climate emergency. So what you're doing this up in Aberdeenshire, who can you partner with? Who is supporting this kind of innovation and experimentation?
I think the short answer is there are lots of organizations out there. Scotland is a hugely innovative, entrepreneurial environment in which to kind of start a business and to think about these innovative products. And we've had a lot of generous support from Scottish Enterprise. They absolutely helped us purchase our sawmill with a grant. But in exchange, we've created 10 jobs. 10 new people, and now I've got a sense of purpose, and that's a great investment for an organisation like Scottish Enterprise, for example. And we're working further with them around research and development to help pull together this process. It's not a simple thing to glue bits of wood together. Anyone can do that at an artisanal level. But if you're actually to try and help solve some of these problems, to help offset some of the volume that might be coming in from abroad and actually make a tangible difference, you kind of need to invest in kit and equipment. And, you know, some of this machinery is measured in the millions of pounds. It's not like, let's spend 10 grand and now we've got a plywood business. It doesn't work like that. So it's that kind of commercialization R&D that takes the passion and enthusiasm of people like us, working with people like Chris, who is providing, you know, Chris and his kind of cohort are the key customers driving this change, because they're at the specification end. And I think there's a lot to be said around that. And then we need to then meet the demand.
So I suppose over to you, Chris, because other than doing benches over the lull between Christmas and New Year and Too Many Quality Street, which I think we got for when we did the call out, you're an architect and you actually kind of lead on the transformation of Jenner's in Edinburgh at the moment. Yeah, and so you, from day to day, you are looking at resources and materials and reuse of a building, repurposing of building. Do you, in the last 5 years, see any changes, glimmers of hope of this understanding of the supply chain and how we source our materials?
Absolutely. I mean, on a kind of wider scale, kind of government policies, legislation, and just the kind of the ESG policies of organizations, corporate organizations is driving change in that sense alone. And as Guy was saying, it is a real issue, because on the face of it, you know, you might specify a plywood and it feels like that's a sustainable option over, say, using a kind of a metal product or a cementitious based product. But actually, when you start to unpick these things, you know, perhaps it's not necessarily any better once you consider where the bulk of it comes from, etc. So I think there is, like a lot of walks of life at the moment, a real sense of where we need to get to. And I think the problem is, like I say, it's a supply chain issue, really. It's a scalability issue. So the kind of guys of this world are the ones who are really needed in that sense as well. And to grow reliable sort of partners and businesses that contractors and clients know they can obtain this material from. And it's you know, the kind of risk of venturing down an alley whereby suddenly all those good intentions fall apart because you can't get what you need in time and on budget is, you know, that's the kind of commercial reality of it. As you say, Jenner's is an odyssey. I'm 4 years into that now, and you know, it's taking shape on site. It's really exciting. I can't say a huge amount about it, but I think sort of being on the inside, everything that is kind of revolving around it in the direction in which it's headed, I think, really exciting. And I can't wait for the point at which the kind of wider public or world become sort of more invited in that, in terms of what it is to become. So yeah, it's
And you, I mean, you, as you say, you work for 3D Reed Architects, but you're working in partnership with David Chipperfield Architects. So we wait for the big reveal and the excitement of what.
Yeah, and I should say there's 3 architects working on the job. So David Chipperfield, ourselves, and Loda Monteith is another local architect. They are doing the conservation architect side of life. So yeah, really kind of a really inspiring project, and again, absolutely grounded in everything we've talked about today, you know, in terms of that desire to really embrace its local context, its culture. Where are you getting the materials from? The kind of people who are contributing to that, you know, there's a huge focus on the locality of it and the celebration of the skills, the talent, and the materials that exist in the context of Scotland. And like I say, that is part of that sort of exciting tale that is kind of threading through the whole thing. So
brilliant. And I think, I mean, what Monolith is all about, and the bringing together of you, Chris, and Guy, is that sharing of knowledge and ideas, and that celebration of craft, ideas, heritage, but also innovation, and an understanding of how we need to kind of champion materials we have close to hand, and a sensitivity to our environment. So I'd just like to thank you very much, Chris and Guy. And it's just been brilliant hearing you kind of talk more fully about the project. And I would invite everybody to get to Mount Stuart if they can and go and sit on Monolith. And there are other benches there as well, so you all kind of crowd into Monolith. I think you probably can get four people into Monolith. But I'd like, and also we'll put links on the podcast to Highland Heritage Woodworks as well, so you can keep an eye on what Guy's doing up there and the importance of this kind of experimentation and pushing forward, and the vital need that we all support these new ideas and new initiatives. So huge thanks to you both, and thank you to everybody listening. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thanks, Dana. Bye.